Hi, everybody. We have a small little lecture here on the Opium Wars to help give another illustration of the different dynamics of European imperialism. So, without any further ado, we are going to set the stage in Qing China in the early 19th century, in the first couple decades, right, of the 1800s. Now, the economic context of China at this time was overall pretty positive still. Their population was growing, which presented them with some challenges, but they were very prosperous and self-sufficient. China accounted for about 1/3 of world manufacturing. So they made a lot of stuff. They were able to grow almost all their own food. All this prosperity, though, did result in a growth of the population, which started to present them with some challenges with poverty and similar consequences. But overall, right, they're doing pretty well. Meanwhile, in Europe at the same time period, a craze for Chinese artistic products known as Chinese-iri, I'm guessing, makes Chinese trading goods even more valuable. So at the same time that China is manufacturing a lot of products, the desirability of these products in the Western world is increasing. Britain, in particular, wants more Chinese silk and Chinese tea. But they didn't really have anything that the Chinese wanted in return. So in other words, Britain is going to China a lot to try to get really desirable trade goods, but China's not really going to Britain to want to get really anything. So the Chinese insisted that the British pay in silver and gold bullion alone, because really that was the only thing of value that they could get out of having this economic relationship with Britain from their perspective. So as a consequence, a lot of silver is going into China and out of Europe, especially Britain, and Britain's not happy with this trade imbalance, and they wanted to find a way to balance that trade relationship. So they began importing opium, which was grown in India, into China. So here again we see these global connections that we talked about last week, right? As a consequence of industrialization, this is a three-part trade, right? It's brought in to China by Britain via India. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this, which is that opium is illegal in China, but it's highly addictive, and the British figure out that they can create a large demand market very quickly. And the textbook at one point says, in some reading, that you're not going to be doing this week and probably won't do it all. Sorry, just attributing where this quote comes from. It says that those attracted to opium included, quote, bored officials, wealthy women cooped up at home, busy clerks, anxious merchants, nervous soldiers, and overworked peasants, end quote. So basically everybody, right? Everybody is, almost everybody in Chinese society is attracted to opium. Opium, by the way, is basically the natural and more mild form of heroin. The primary ingredient you get high from opium from is the primary ingredient in heroin. So as we're dealing with our current opiate addiction, right, in the United States, that should give you some idea, right, of the effects and the addictiveness of this drug. Now, the British see this market expanding, and they see the potential to make it even larger, and they lower their prices on opium to further drive sales. One might ask, how do they do this if it's illegal? Well, they also find that bribing Chinese officials to smuggle in the opium is not that difficult. And so you also have a corruption of the Qing government going on, because you're having officials basically getting rich off of taking bribes to allow opium be smuggled in. So there are huge social consequences to this huge influx of opium into China for Chinese society. By 1838, there are as many as 10 million addicts in China. That's the top estimate of how many there might have been. This leads to a lot of social dysfunction, and it leads to a lot of poverty. And one Chinese official wrote that opium is nothing else but a flowing poison which utterly ruins the minds and morals of the people, a dreadful calamity, end quote. This image here in the background is of an opium den, which were these places that sprung up all, wherever opium could be got in China, where people would go and smoke opium and being the effect of, opiates, just pretty much kind of pass out in these opium dens. Britain, however, couldn't care less about the impact of the opium trade on Chinese society, as they were making bank, and in fact they doubled their opium imports during the 1830s. So the Chinese attempt to do something about this huge opium addiction epidemic, and a highly respected official with a reputation for being uncorruptible, Lin Zizhu, and this is a painting of him here on the right, is appointed to stamp out the epidemic. Now, after attempting to negotiate with the British fails, attempting to try to arrange some situation that would curb the amount of opium coming in, Lin raided Western warehouses, and he destroyed 20,000 chests of opium worth millions of dollars. And the British are pissed, and they go to war over this. They declare war. And the Chinese expected that they would first hit the one port where, at that time, the British were officially allowed to do trade, Guangzhou, also known as Canton by the British. But instead, the British sailed past Guangzhou/Canton, and they strike in Nanjing first, and the Chinese are taken by surprise, and a bad war starts badly. During the short duration of the war, it's only 3 years, it becomes clear that the Chinese are outmatched by the military technology of the British, and the defeats that they suffer are pretty harsh. Dozens of officials, when it becomes clear that this war is going to be lost, commit suicide. And the conclusion of the war, the Treaty of Nanjing, which ends the war, is extremely demeaning for the Chinese. So here on the presentation, we just have listed that they have to give British Hong Kong, which is this island off the coast of China, and it wasn't until I was in high school, so what was that? The 2000s? Or was I in college? I can't even remember anymore. It was very recently that Hong Kong was actually returned to China. Okay. Again, that's why, because they were forced to give this island to the British. But there's many other things about this treaty. They were forced to open 5 more ports to British trade. At that time, it was just 1. They were forced to set fixed tariffs, or the British set these fixed tariffs, which effectively took control of their economic policy out of the hands of China, because Britain decided how much they would be taxed, right, for their imports. And they had to give the British immunity from local laws, which meant basically if you're a British citizen, you can China and do whatever the hell you want, and you can't be tried by Chinese courts. And finally, the Treaty of Nanjing forced China to pay for the costs of the war. So it's an extremely lopsided treaty. It's extremely humiliating for the Chinese. So, of course, this breeds a lot of resentment amongst the Chinese. And they respond by being pretty lax and pretty lazy about enforcing these agreements and trying to subvert them whenever they can. And moreover, opium is still illegal in China. That's one thing that wasn't in the Treaty of Nanjing. It did not force the legalization of opium. And this really irks the British, both that opium is still legal and that, the Chinese are not executing this treaty very faithfully. So Britain finds a pretext to renew hostilities, and shortly after, France also finds a pretext and joins in on the side of the British, because France is a Western country also with the interests of capitalizing on the possible trade with China. So in 1856, the Second Opium War begins. This time it lasts 4 years instead of 3, but again, the Chinese lose. And this time, when the peace is made, they are not only once again forced to pay the war costs, but they have to open more ports, allow Western traders into trading posts along the interior rivers, allow Christian missionaries back into China, and allow foreign embassies to be established in Beijing. And because these wars drained China's resources and energy, they also ultimately led to China having to give up its claim to Vietnam, which was then a vassal state to China, but being colonized by the French. So they, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Sorry, I haven't been putting this up here. So they lose Vietnam to the French, okay? And likewise, they allowed Russia to take over eastern Siberia, right? Because they're extremely drained. They don't have the resources to hold on to these territories. Finally, these developments led to the creation of internal settlements within Chinese cities where, amazingly, only Europeans, mostly wealthy merchants and other elites, European elites, could go. So, in your own country, right, foreign people are setting up really classy neighborhoods that they exclude you from unless you're a servant, on the basis of you're not good enough to be here, on the basis of racism, right? So this is pretty messed up. And overall, right, the Opium Wars is an illustration of China trying to exercise its sovereignty over its economic policy and solve a really paralyzing social problem, right? And basically quite straightforwardly, being prevented from doing so by a foreign nation who forced free trade on them. So, sort of a takeaway here of this short little look at the Opium Wars is to consider first that imperialism is not just a matter of territory, right, of taking over land or space. It always comes hand in hand with, and sometimes it consists only of, economic coercion, right? It's not like there was a big British settlement project that took off in China, but what did happen was the British were able to extend their financial and economic reach, right, further and further into China, wherever they wanted to go. So an empire can be an economic empire, right? It doesn't just have to be a matter of how much of your territory shades the map. Secondly, next time you hear someone wax poetic about quote-unquote free trade, think about the Opium Wars, which is only one of the most obvious examples of how free trade, so-called, was brought to the world more often than not at gunpoint. In other words, it's enforced by the threat of violence, which is usually the opposite, right, of how its most zealous advocates depict it, right? It's free. right? How could anything with the word free before it be dependent on imperialistic violence? All right, so that's it for our little lecture this week.